All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of TDRS. Now, noticeably, you can see that we are just changing every week with this awesome dynamic. So our sister Tanisha is not going to be on with us today. Definitely doing her thing in the world, and so we look forward to seeing her on Monday, June 7th, because as you guys know, Memorial Day is next week, and I'm hoping that everyone is going to be spending time with loved ones, family members, doing something positive in the world. And hopefully, if you're in places like Chicago and Atlanta, not getting shot. But we definitely want to welcome back our brother Neo, who is doing phenomenal things. We actually talked about it a little bit today on our one-on-one series on Atlanta. And so, brother Neo, welcome back, brother, and tell us all of the great things happening with you and the Black Wall Street Times.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be back. I feel like I've been gone for too long. Right now in Tulsa, we are getting ready to have our grand opening of the Black Wall Street Times. So we've been established for, since 2017. And, now we're actually going to have a brick and mortar store and an office space. So it'll pretty much be a newsroom and a retail space to kind of help us keep our journalism afloat.
Yeah, I love that, man. I'm so proud. I'm always smiling when I see you post the pictures about the opening, and hopefully Chris or Zakia are listening, because I think it would be great if the TDRS family could be there on this Thursday. And I know that there's someone listening, someone in the digital world, someone in the Bright Beam Network. Maybe Peter can get us there to join in the festivities, but also this amazing celebration. Neo, I have to say this: my students, the Atlanta Student Coalition, are so impressed. My middle school students were trying to, and I mentioned this to you before, they were trying to organize a field trip to get down there, but the last day of school is Thursday. So they were like, we need our time. And I said, hey, reclaim your time. I totally get it. But they did work really hard to get a field trip going to get down there. And so as we're talking about all of this history in the world, I know I showed up today with my Morris Brown shirt on. Like, this is a complete throwback from the 90s, hat and all, paying honor to the HBCUs. And we're awaiting our guest to come on and talk about the amazing work that she's doing with her book. And, I have a lot of call to actions today. So my first call to action, everyone, before we pivot off to the much needed conversation around HBCUs, reimagining school for Black and brown children, what the Atlanta Student Coalition is working on right now, which is getting reparations for Black and brown students who want to attend a HBCU, regardless of the degree, whether it's bachelor's, advanced, doctoral, they need it and they want it. And so they're coming for what's there. So all I can say is, America, get that bag ready, because Gen Z is coming for what is owed to them. But before we get into all of that, Brother Neo, how can people connect with the Black Wall Street Times and all of these amazing specials that I'm seeing that are coming up on OWN and BET? They actually should be on Fox. They should be on NBC and ABC. So let me throw that out there as well for any PR people who may be tuning into this conversation. It definitely needs to be there. How can people connect with the Black Wall Street Times in this historical moment?
So as you know, and some of the viewers know, the centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is getting ready to start, which is, I believe it's the 31st, the 31st, which is Memorial Day, to the 1st. That is when 100 years ago, a white mob descended onto our community of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and destroyed everything. They looted, pillaged, bombed, and massacred 300 of our people. And when it was all over, 18 hours later, there was nothing left in the Greenwood district. The entire community was in ashes. But yeah, there is so much history that has not been told about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. When we also have streaming that's going to be taking place. There's an event that's going to be taking place for several days, beginning on Friday, which is the day after our grand opening, and that is called the Legacy Fest, the Black Wall Street Legacy Fest. And so the Black Wall Street Legacy Fest pretty much commemorates the massacre, the 3 living survivors, which I have to also tell you about, and then the living descendants. And I am a descendant of families who owned businesses in Black Wall Street. And actually, the grand opening of the Black Wall Street Times, our physical location is on the same street that one of my ancestors, my second great grandparents, owned a tailor shop, which was just a block over from where I'm at now, 100 years ago that they owned it.
Yeah, that's some awesome history, brother.
Yeah, it never reopened after the massacre took place. But on the Cherry side, those businesses did reopen and they continued. But yeah, so about the living survivors, I don't know if you saw, I had journeyed to Washington, D.C. Last Wednesday, and I sat in a historic congressional hearing about the Tulsa Race Massacre, in which I accompanied other descendants, but most importantly, the 3 last known living survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And so 2 of them were siblings. So there are their siblings, and that is Mother Viola Fletcher and her brother Van Hughes Ellis, who is he's 100. Mother Fletcher is 107. She just celebrated her 107th birthday earlier this month. And then Mother Randall Bedingfield, she joined us via Zoom. And so it was a really interesting experience, just, sitting behind them and hearing their personal testimonies of, what they experienced after the massacre and during it. And, it brought me to tears because my second great grandparents and my great grandparents, most of them passed before I was even really old enough to, see them or listen to their oral histories and oral accounts of the massacre. And so it was a gift to listen, but it was painful at the same time because, that would be the closest account of what my own people experienced, on the night of the massacre and then the next day.
Yeah, when we were watching Lovecraft and so many shows that are really speaking to the relationship of what happened in Tulsa across the nation, I was, blessed to know my great grandparents. My great grandmother lived to be 104 on my dad's side. And, she lost her first husband in a fire because he was an entrepreneur in a small town in North Carolina. And those are stories that people probably would never hear. And Tulsa is not alone in the fact that there was a lot taken from Black people, which really gets us to our conversation around the ABCs of HBCUs, the important role that they have played in our communities, in education. A lot of the churches that were connected and are connected to HBCUs that really helped us have safe spaces to learn, but also to hide freedom fighters, liberators, innovators who were doing amazing things that captured a lot of this history and thankfully has empowered so many of us who are descendants of those who have lost so much here in this country. And it's our time too to advocate for what's definitely needed that was taken from our ancestors and making sure that our future generations have it. So I want to talk a little bit about Claudia Walker, who is an Oakland-based author. And shout out to Oakland. I don't know if Claudia knows Anthony Wilson. He is the executive director of equity and education here in Atlanta, also from Oakland. And so we have a couple of family members, a part of the Bright Beam Network, in various capacities that are from there too. So I know she's going to have some amazing things to say. But like our brother Neo, she's been featured in so many great things, from Essence Magazine, New York Times. Her book is the ABCs of HBCUs. And so we are going to get right into that on today. Now, Claudia, I know you also went to Spelman, if I'm correct about that, because I did my homework. My best friend, one of my best friends, graduated from Spelman, and a lot of my classmates. And so I put on my HBCU gear, representing Morris Brown, which, introduced me to HBCUs, and my throwback 90s gear, because HBCUs were really rocking in the 90s. So welcome to TDRS and our show. I hate that Tanisha is not here to talk up this powerful work around HBCUs. Of course, we're going to talk about equity. We're going to talk about your book. I'm going to do a plug on how we can get this book into more of our schools, because when I checked with my school leaders here in Atlanta, they were like, is the school system about to buy us this? So I'm hoping that those board members that, chime into this conversation are ready to get some funds together. But Claudia, tell us a little bit about you. Welcome to TDRS. And yeah, let's hear from you.
Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for having me. It is it's such an honor. So yeah, you said it. I mean, my name is Claudia Walker. I graduated from Spelman. I too have on my Spelman gear. And shout out to Morris Brown and everyone in the AUC. My brother actually graduated from Morris Brown in the early or mid 2000s. I am an educator here in Oakland. I am a mom of 3. And I wrote this book for many reasons, but really what was central to the writing of the book was my experience as a mom and as an educator. Again, living here on the West Coast, we don't have the same kind of access to HBCUs as, folks do who live in the South or even on the East Coast. And so every year, I would take my children to Atlanta, and my daughter and I would go on to Spelman's campus and, just really indoctrinate her into the culture of the Black college experience. But that was just one day out of 365. And so when I would come back to the Bay Area, I really wanted to find a way to share that experience with her and even more so my students. I have taught everything from middle school. I currently work at the high school level. And for many of our students here, they have never heard of HBCUs. Maybe junior, senior year when the Black College Tour comes around, might be their first exposure. But I really wanted to write something that was a celebration of the Black college experience and introduce children and educators, because we have a lot of educators, a lot of folks who, are adults and don't know about HBCUs or don't believe that HBCUs are competitive or viable options for students. And so that's why I decided to write the book.
Yeah, I love all that. You're absolutely right. I have a couple of things, and I definitely want to add into the conversation from my students, who have definitely been talking about the importance of HBCUs and the lack of public institutions to prepare them for college. Well, one, they're not really preparing them for high school, so how can they be ready for college? But you brought up such an interesting point. It took me back to Douglas County when I was teaching special education, and my students were like, they had never heard of HBCUs. And so, Douglas County is maybe like 15, 20 minutes outside
Right.
of the city of Atlanta, where, Black and brown students are literally driving distance, if their parents or a field trip, 30 minutes from Spelman and the AUC itself, and have never heard of it, seen it, experienced it. And I was like, what are we doing wrong here? And so I want to ask you this question. What can we do to really get the HBCU experience to those Black and brown students who are not in inner city public schools?
So I think that it has to be really intentional on the parts of folks who believe in it, right? I think that the reason why there hasn't been the same kind of exposure, whether someone is in a public or private school, or whether they're in the city or outside in the suburbs, is intentional. The people who are oftentimes at the helm or who are in the school buildings are, I believe, intentionally not exposing children to Black colleges or colleges in general. I mean, we got to even back up from Black colleges and talk about the fact that many of our Black and brown students aren't even being encouraged to go to college, and in many cases aren't even, their experience is such that even graduating high school, right, is a thing. It's a big deal. And so when we have people who are really intentional, educators, community members who are really intentional about providing a high quality, equitable education for Black and brown students, then we start talking about what that looks like. So how do we make education equitable? How do we make learning fun? How do we make children recognize their full potential? Then we get into the conversations of, okay, well, what can this look like? And I think, people, as an educator, the conversation regularly is around creating spaces, creating schools that are really teaching our children and that make learning exciting. And so, everything from, as an educator, I mean, there's so many things, so many tricks that people try to do. Whether it's changing curriculum, now we are using Common Core, sometimes it's call and response, I mean, there's so many things. But it's interesting because as an educator, I found that it changes every 10 years, right? Like something new comes along. Okay, this is the thing that's gonna fix the educational gap, right? And since 1837, we got HBCUs that are like, we've been doing this. We've been doing this work. We've been creating spaces where kids of color feel safe, where Black folks feel safe, where they're getting a quality education, where they're coming in and then leaving as leaders. And so my question has been, why has the American education system not been looking at the over 100 Black colleges as a model of what they should be doing to create these spaces that are doing a great job of educating Black kids? And I don't have the answer to why that's not happening. But hopefully, I think that recently there has been a lot of attention and energy around Black colleges. And so, I won't say that I'm hopeful, but I'm hopeful that, that leads to some interesting conversations within the K-12 space.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things that I know, there's so many challenges around this, right? And even in our conversation. So I went to a PWI, a predominantly white institution. I'm very mindful of acronyms as a special education teacher, that if you say the acronym, you got to tell the people what it is. And one of the things that I found there, the experience was totally different. Like growing up in Atlanta, we had involvement as early as middle school with Upward Bound, Morris Brown, again, shout out to NBC, and the AUC schools. And, we had that experience. Our high schools in Atlanta at one point in time, definitely not now, they were mini HBCUs. And that was something that really helped bring excitement back to wanting to go to college. We had that involvement from the HBCUs. We had A Different World. We had Martin and other shows that were on, mainstream TV that were promoting HBCUs, supporting and elevating Blackness. And, a lot of that is still in some regards, in some aspect, missing right now today. You mentioned two things, and I want to ask you a question about both. Teachers and being, prepared to even acknowledge and understand how to infuse HBCUs in their pedagogy and what they're teaching. What are your thoughts on ways that HBCUs can help to, let's say, revamp the teacher pipeline? As you know, there's a teacher shortage right now. It's a major crisis. We're talking about a health crisis, but in education, which impacts economics, because people want their children to go back to school, because we've seen a lot of parents are like, okay, this was great. I love my child, but I need that separation. I need them back in the a place of learning where we had that time apart and we could come back together and love on each other and be happy. But parents are finding out the hard way that you're wanting to send your child back to school and there are no teachers. Not because, we just hate teaching, but because of the lack of professional development and innovation and support around being able to teach in ways where we can reach all children. So how do you think that HBCUs can play an intricate role in the way that we're recruiting and we are preparing teachers to go into classrooms?
That's a great question. So I think that when I came out of Spelman, before I graduated from Spelman, my junior year, I was recruited by a couple of Wall Street firms to come and do an internship and spend some time in New York. And it was through an intentional program that they had built to try to diversify this old boy network. And I think that, the same things need to happen in education. In addition to the teacher shortage, you also have a shortage of teachers of color, of Black teachers, specifically of Black male teachers. And so if school systems and districts are serious about wanting to make sure that their staff, their teaching force reflects the students that they're teaching, that I think that recruiting from HBCUs is a first step. And then I think additionally, even if you attended a PWI, anyone who is interested in working in, school district that has predominantly Black kids or kids of color, I think, the same way that we tell our students to go on to a college campus just to get a feel for it, I think it would be a great idea to have teachers also visit HBCUs, sit in on some of the classes and go into the cafeteria and attend some of the different events and just get a sense of, talk to some of the professors and the presidents and students, right? To get a sense of like what works, what really makes the HBCU experience so profound. And then I also think that, we know some of the things that that really draws students and even alum to HBCUs. And so that's just a feeling of community. I think that the school districts and teachers, educators need to figure out, how do I create this sense of community that that students feel when they go to an HBCU, keeping in mind that because it's a Black college doesn't mean that it's 100% African-American or of African descent, right? HBCUs are very diverse places. So there are HBCUs that are predominantly white. There are HBCUs that have, a very high Latinx population. So trying to figure out how these schools are inclusive and create a sense of community. And then, I think that something that is also really unique about HBCUs is that they are very competitive. They're competitive amongst HBCUs, whether it's Howard versus Hampton or this school versus another. That competitive nature, I think, really drives a sense of pride in the school and wanting to outdo your neighbor, right? And so how do we create that within the classroom, whether it's, Miss Hill's 5th grade class versus Mr. Brown's 5th grade class, or this particular school versus this school across, down the hill? How do we create this feeling where kids feel excited, like I want to perform because I'm representing my classroom, I'm representing my school, I'm representing my community? So I think it's picking out some of the things that HBCUs, you don't have to pick everything, but some of the things HBCUs or particular schools within your neighborhood or that you just kind of pick out and adopt does exceptionally well, and finding a way to replicate that within different schools.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm coming around to your book when I'm talking about pipeline in a second. So let me just throw out now, I'm going to give you this. And I'm also calling on Profound Ladies, one of the organizations that I'm connected with through Profound Gentlemen. Now, Profound Ladies is designed to recruit and retain women of color in classrooms and in educational spaces. And so if any of them are tuned in today, or if Jason, who is our executive director of Profound Gentlemen, is tuned in, we need a virtual book tour that connects you and other Black women, Black and brown women authors. I always say Black and brown because if my students are watching, which I know they probably are, they'll get me and say, now, Mr. Allen, you left the Afro-Latinas and the Latinx community. I said, no, I didn't. So Black and brown, however we identify, let's get this virtual book tour going, because here's the reality. When I was having conversations with my students this morning before the awards show, I said, hey, do y'all know about this book? Do your siblings have this book? They had no clue. And these are students across the metro Atlanta area. And I said, well, wait a minute, we messing up right here. If these are leaders, like my students are leaders and they're activists, exceptional learners that, have access because I'm showing them how to get access, and they weren't aware. And I said, name 5 Black female authors, go. And they could not name any current ones outside of the people on my wall.
Yeah.
So I said, yeah, we need to come up with a solution. So that's my public service announcement. Profound ladies, Jason, you can use this as an exit strategy to get this virtual book tour going. We need to expose our students to these things. And so I want to ask you a question again connected to the pipeline. One of the comments that you made was that, HBCUs already have a structure, and they do. So I want to ask you this. We have independent charter schools. Shout out to Christina Guillen. She's been on TDRS before. She is the head of schools of Seven Pillars Career Academy, where I'm the founding special education teacher and also teaching part-time social justice, right? And we are connected with Kwanzaa and uplifting HBCUs and their principles in the work that we do. How can we create a pipeline pre-K to HBCUs with students that are Black and brown, in between, however you want to identify, can go to independent freedom-based schools from pre-K to 12th grade that have now prepared them for an excellent experience at an HBCU?
It has to be intentional. I mean, I think it's doing the work that you're talking about. And when I founded my publishing company, which is called HBCU Prep School, and I named, people always think it's a school, but I named it that because I started my career in education working at a charter school, and I really wanted to open my own charter school. And then I started having babies, and I was like, I don't know if I have I have what it takes.
You can still do it.
To really do this work. I don't know. I don't know. And so for me, this publishing company is my school, right? It's a way that I'm able to impact so many students with the books that we're coming out with and the activity books and workbooks. But I think it's starting at a young age. And so when I wrote the ABCs of HBCUs, because it's an ABC book, I really intended it to be that kind of early kind of preschool experience that you were talking about. And then I created some flashcards for my son, who was 4 at the time. And so, at most schools, you see, your ABC flashcards, and A is for apple and B is for banana. Well, with our flashcards, A is for Alcorn, is for Alabama A&M, is for Allen University, it's for every HBCU that starts with the letter A. And so I think that it has to be intentional within the community of saying, how do we make sure that we are creating this pipeline from before our children are getting into school, right? So that the exposure is there, so that they recognize there's not just one option. There are over 100 historically Black colleges and universities that I can choose from. And I have to also say this, I'm not the only author out there with a book about HBCUs. There are other people who are doing this incredible work, who are trying to lift up the experience of Black colleges and share that with children. So there are people that are doing the work. And so I think it's just about community members saying, this is what we want for our children. Let's go.
I'm impressed, right, that it was a dream for a school and it transferred into a publishing company. And I wrote that down. Dreams can change. So if you're listening, if you're a teacher, a parent, if you are living and breathing, know that your dreams can change, right? We always talk about dreams being deferred, but we really don't talk about how dreams can change. And I think that was a perfect example of, I started out dreaming this and wanting to do this, and it transferred into this. And our students need to hear that. They have to be connected to those experiences, but also intentionality. I love that you brought that up about how we can do it. Now, for those of us who are connected to, people who have their own early learning centers, Montessori's, who are independent freedom school builders, whether it's K through 3, let me put some ideas out here. K through 3, K through 5, K through 8, whether it's 5 through 8, whether it's 5 through 12. Even if you're not in a network together, build networks, right? We have to be creative about how we do this and are building pipelines to get our children to the best educational spaces for them. And also recognizing, right, that HBCUs may not be for everyone.
That's right.
And not knocking that. Now, I want to ask you about this, though. There's a lot of conversation out here. And yeah, guys, let me tell you, I had some conversations on Atlanta on Friday for Malcolm X Day. Shout out to our brother Malcolm, regarding critical race theory. And I'm coming down that avenue because we can't, be talking about HBCUs and not talk about critical race theory. But we also cannot talk about literacy in the conversation for HBCUs. As we all know, the projections were out even before we were the third month into the pandemic with Black and brown children and the decrease in literacy. And I reached out to a couple of Atlanta educational leaders again. I'm like, this book, y'all, I'm not on the book promoting to it, but I'm like, this is awesome. I got a chance to check it out. Had great conversations with Brian, so shout out to him. And I was like, this is powerful, right? But why are we not connected, to this? And one of the things that one of the leaders here in Atlanta said is that our public school districts are not investing in culturally inclusive curriculum. So when we get the standards, when we get the plans from the district, we're not getting on those lists of resources your name. We're not getting other Black and brown men and women who have created all of this amazing literature so that our children can be exposed. And so I want to start us off with this. What are your thoughts about this dip in literacy rate for Black and brown children, and what responsibility do public institutions have to make sure that the literature they're presenting to these children is reflective of them?
So I think the pandemic has been hard for everyone. It was something that no one could have predicted. And I think as an educator, it was incredibly hard for us to figure out how we were going to pivot from in-person to virtual, hybrid, or whatever combination of it became. And for children in particular, it has been incredibly challenging. I think that children have responded differently to it. I had some children who found that virtual was a bit better fit for them than in person. But that was in the early, that was like last year this time, the first couple of months. I think as it has just moved through, now we're over a year into it, it has become more challenging, and social isolation has been difficult. And, on top of that, we know that Black and brown communities have been most impacted health-wise by COVID. So you're looking at, not just the impact on education, but on mental health, on economic stability within the family. And that takes a toll on children. When we look at the decrease in reading gains, I guess I think of this a number of ways. I mean, first, I think it's important for us to make sure that our children are whole and healthy. That's most important, because I have students who are holding on by a thin thread, right? And so right now, they're not really thinking about, this math homework or reading. They're just trying to figure out how they're going to eat. They're worried about mom, grandma. They're worried about those things, right? So we got to make sure that we are providing these wraparound services to families to make sure that they are okay. But beside that, we do have to make sure that we are doing the work to make sure that our children aren't falling behind, though we know that they are. And so to that end, I think it really is the responsibility of educators, again, community members, to figure out, what do we do? How do we stand in the gap? If the school districts aren't providing what needs to, what they should in order to reach every child, how do we as individuals, how do we as a network go and get those kids and make sure that we are supporting them in the ways that they need? And so we had some people here who were going to different schools, who were knocking on kids' doors, setting up outside and like, hey, let's get to work, right? Because sometimes it really just takes that face-to-face, masked face-to-face interaction. And, to your point, this goes back to what makes HBCUs so incredibly special. When I first stepped onto Spelman's campus as a freshman, one of the required classes that we took was called African Diaspora the African diaspora in the world. So it was ADW. Before that, I had gone to elite private schools. I had never heard of the diaspora. I didn't know what a diaspora was. I thought, well, if you weren't born in, America, and the descendants of slaves in America, then you're not Black. And Spelman in that class really taught me about the diaspora and how all of these people come from Africa, but they can settle in different parts of the world, different regions of the world. And so again, it's important that we make sure, especially for our reluctant readers, that we are providing access to literature that really speaks to them. And so, it is incumbent upon school districts to make sure that, as we are making these pivots and these shifts in education, that they're making sure that the curriculum and the required reading is also reflective of those shifts. And so I do have to say, I have so much love. I should have gotten a list together because we've gotten a lot of love from folks from schools within Atlanta. I believe it was a charter network. And, here in Oakland, we've gotten a lot of love from school districts and other school districts in Northern California. So, I think that there are people who are recognizing, whether it's a teacher who sees the book and says, I got to talk to the principal, and the principal says, I got to talk to the network superintendent or whoever it is. There are folks who are saying, yep, we need to make sure that our children have access. Shout out to school librarians. We've had so many that have also helped to make sure that, our schools are in the classrooms. But, it's a constant battle, right? It is trying to make that headway and make sure that people recognize that the shelves must be diversified. The way that things have to be years ago can't still, remain if we're going to make sure that our kids are progressing.
Yeah, a lot of great points there. And, experience is key. My takeaway from everything you just said is experience is key. I did not make a list, but I do know one school that I'm connected to, which is Ivy Prep. It's the state of Georgia's first charter commissioned school for all girls. And they do have the book there. A couple of the teachers who went to Spelman are definitely connected. I just had the head of schools on in Atlanta last week. And, they are connected. And that's really important. I want to also highlight this. Our Atlanta Student Coalition leaders are doing a lot of work in the metro Atlanta area around having their superintendents and their curriculum leaders on the district level look at creating an HBCU college readiness track. And why is this important? Because people are like, well, why do they need to have a track specifically for that? Well, here's the deal. Now, I think you spoke so well to it, and I'm actually looking at Tony's comment on the screen, is that everyone doesn't have the same experience. So where you went to a private school and you were not connected to that information about the African diaspora and what's happening in other places in the world, our legacy, our connection to Mexico and Cuba and other, places, right? So I think too often, and I tell my students this, you can't expect Mr. Allen to show up in everybody and in every space, because we all have our own unique individual experiences that makes us who we are. And one of the things that my students could agree upon is that we do have some teachers that go to HBCUs, but we have a lot of teachers who don't. And we also talked about this, going back to the pipeline comment, that if you let's look at Georgia, the state of Georgia, they do not have one Black-owned organization or entity that trains teachers on the state level, nor have they a partnership with an HBCU. So think about all of the hundreds of thousands of teachers that go through Georgia teaching certification training programs that don't even get resources of, hey, here are HBCUs. Here are how you can connect your students with these programs. Here are resources. Here are books. Here are authors that are in our state that are doing the work that can connect us, right? So I'm saying all of that to ask your thoughts on my students' work around building HBCU college readiness programs in public school systems, so children as early as 4th grade can start getting those resources, those experiences, and those connections. What are your thoughts?
So you said that your students are?
Yeah, my students.
Tell me more about that. That's exciting.
The Atlanta Student Coalition, we have students. It actually started out with my students that I mentioned in 7 pillars in my class that I'm teaching on social justice. And make the longer story short, that inspired other students, their cousins, former students of mine, and started seeing things we were doing. And so we built this coalition of students in the metro area. And so when we meet every week, we had these conversations. Some of them have been on this podcast, which was very bold. um, and they actually tuned into these conversations. And so we talked about this. And that was one of the things. They were like, listen, I want to go to HBCU, but my school has not done anything to expose me to HBCUs. And I'm not even really getting exposed to the money that's out there. And so I was like, hey, guys, we got to figure out how to get to the bag. Where does the money reside? Well, school boards, right? They control these things. They influence policy. They influence change. And so that's directly who they say, hey, Mr. Allen, we're writing an email to the board. We want to have a meeting. We want to present this to them. And they did just that. And so we're having conversations with school board members across the area. We've brought school board members to our platform, right? And so as someone who has written a book around the ABCs of HBCUs, that's the work that students are saying needs to be done. So as someone who has definitely written about it, and you've spoken to some of this as well in our conversation, I kind of see this glow now. It's like I can feel your energy. Like, yeah, this is what's needed. What are your thoughts?
I mean, the reason that you probably feel that is I am so encouraged by young folks. I am so incredibly encouraged by young folks. And while as adults, we are, doing the work, right, where we recognize that there's a gap, that there's something missing. Our young people are really the key. They've got the energy, they've got the creativity. They're not limited by some of the boxes that we, as adults kind of have around, or the limitations that we've accepted. They push through that. They're like, no, this is my reality, and this is what I want to be my reality. And so how do we get there? So oftentimes they need or can use the support of an adult. But I'm so encouraged by the work that your students are doing, because it's needed. And I was just talking to my students last week, and I think that sometimes what I was saying is I think that sometimes because of their age, young folks can think like, I'm not ready. I don't have the tools. I'm not equipped for this fight. When in reality, they really do have all that they need. I think that now we're in a space where we recognize the brilliance of our young folks and that they're different. They're like, either you help me to get what it is that I want, or I'll figure it out without you. And so I think that it takes that kind of grassroots work. And I think what I would also say to your students is that when you look at these HBCUs, for all of them started as a dream, right? They started as an idea.
Yeah.
And so if the students are recognizing that there's something that's missing and they want to create something not just for themselves, but for future generations, then it starts with that dream. And you continue to work and you continue to talk to school boards and the folks who have, the power to implement whatever it is that you're looking to have changed. And so I'm encouraged, and I'm so inspired.
Yeah, that's good. I smile about it. I think that we need to give our youth, Gen Z, a different opportunity, right? And I'm looking at the comments. I'm also, thinking about other adults that we've had these conversations with. And Generation Z is very mindful, right? They have white friends who live in lower income communities because white privilege is a real thing, right? But we also know that classism plays a role in that too, that sexism plays a role in that too. So they are not, they're not dismissive of others. And I think that we as a people are very inclusive when the current systems in America are not inclusive of us, even though what we want to build, the things that we see, know that we need to change them, are going to be for all people. And so that's something that they definitely, have talked up. They actually did a survey for it, and they asked students their ideas. And 13% of the white students in this now predominantly thriving Black and brown school district, they are interested in HBCUs. So what is the why behind that, though? And here's the why. They feel safer. Interesting, right? They feel safer at HBCUs and in places where our kids are, because they realize that there is something different there. And there is a sense of unity and acceptance there that has been created, because a lot of people don't realize that our students are saying they need these things because they're not getting them. They're in cultures and classrooms that don't embrace them. So out of the 13 or 14 school leaders that I sent text messages to this morning about your book that are all over Metro Atlanta, one school. And so that speaks a lot, that even though we have these systems in place, right, everyone is still not getting the resources. And so I'm looking at the time, and as I think about resources and how we, really start to dismantle the system, I want to ask your thoughts about critical race theory. We know that this is based on really based on economic and educational freedom, right? That really will teach people on how we dismantle a system where laws were created to protect systemic racism. Now, that may be my take on it. I know that my minor is Africana Studies, and shout out to Dr. Maxine Sample, who actually, was talking about this in the early 2000s. This is a conversation from the 70s, and people are thinking that, oh, white people don't want inclusive curriculum in schools, so this just happened. No, it didn't just happen. So it also connects to the type of literature, such as books like yours, that our children, and not just Black and brown children. Let me make that clear too, because when I say our children, I'm speaking about my students. My students are white, Black, mixed, et cetera, so forth. I have to explain that to people because, we as adults, we too make assumptions a lot of times. So I like clarity, right? But for our children, they do want to see other representation. And so there's a big debate around critical race theory. I don't know if you keep up with that or not, but I do just want to see your thoughts around that. And more importantly, the inclusiveness that is needed in our curriculums in public schools to really expose our children to different outcomes.
Yeah, so I work at a school that is, here in Oakland. It is predominantly Latinx and African American. And I think when we look at the types of shifts, well, I think when we step back for a bit, when we look at the educational system, we know that there are structures and systems in place that are intentionally designed to push kids of color and poorer kids into the periphery. And that's intentional. I think when we look at not just the structures, but when we look at the types of curriculum, even up until a few years ago, the types of holidays even that were celebrated within the school districts, that had a lot to do with structural racism. And so I think it is incredibly important that school districts, and, when I talk about school districts, I'm it's kind of higher level, but I think in order to really make change, I go back to the folks in the building. Because if we leave it up to school districts, not much will change, right? I mean, people are typically like, well, if nobody is there, nobody's fighting back, nobody's saying anything, everybody is happy, it's status quo. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. So in order for us to make the type of progress that we want to see, it's important that there are educators, there are parents, there are students that you talk about that are saying, it's important that I learn about my history, the true history, not this whitewashed version of my history, not about me being my true history. Because sometimes we believe that Black history starts with slavery, and that is not the truth. So it's important that our students are not just learning about their own history. It's important that students are learning about other history, because when they leave our schools, it's important that they're able to have these critical conversations with other folks. It's funny, I had a student at school who, at my school, we stopped teaching AP English because it was this kind of very Eurocentric lens of literature, of culture, of history. And we taught our humanities classes through this lens of this dominant narrative of folks of color. And one of the students came back and said, that was great, but I never actually learned about white history. I went to school and everyone else was talking about, you know, this kind of European history and the presidents, and I didn't really learn that. And so, you know, we told the student, you learned it through a different lens. You didn't learn it through this dominant narrative of white history, but you still learned it. It was just through a different lens. And so I think it's important that, you know, we recognize that it's important and it's imperative for our children to see themselves as leaders, to look at their history as one of empowerment, to look at themselves as change agents. And if we look at history, that's what we see, right?
That's right.
And so there's so much work to be done, but I think that it can happen within classrooms. And when you see it happening in classrooms and these conversations happening, not just with the teacher, but with students, then that can spread to other classrooms, that spreads to the school, that then spreads through the district, right? And so it's important work, it's challenging work. There are no easy solutions, there are no easy fixes, but I think the conversations need to start and then the work needs to take place.
Yeah, I'm looking at the comments, and thank you to everybody that's tuned in. Please like and share this conversation out with others. You know, these are not easy conversations, and everyone has different perspectives, you know, ideas and experiences. So just love seeing everyone giving some feedback, asking questions. I love that. There's no wrong question. I always tell my students there is no stupid question unless you weren't paying attention and someone said it 3 or 4 times and then repeated it to you twice and you still just weren't listening and you asked them for a 7th time. Now, I don't know. You know, people may be out of grace by that point. I don't know. I can't speak to that.
Yeah.
But I like your thoughts around critical race theory, because the reality is, you know, we don't focus on the law. That is the challenge. Like, my students have said that they've talked with lawmakers, from Council Member Antonio Brown, or policymakers to Civil Rights Attorney Gerald Griggs and others, most recently with one of the DAs in Gwinnett, talking about how do we change policy? Like, how do we impact the laws? Well, first of all, they're having to learn this. And I saw somebody mention community organizations, or maybe at home, because we know that, or maybe people don't know, but our public schools, they're not teaching this. They're not even scratching the surface of this. And so, yes, these conversations are so important, because one of my students wrote a powerful article on Atlanta talking about the fear that she has about returning to school to face-to-face learning, when now I got to walk back out of my house now, and all of the racial tension that continues to happen and it's going unanswered and people don't know what to do. And every time we turn on the TV, someone is still getting shot by law enforcement. Like, not just, you know, I walked out the house and there's a gang war, you know, that's happening, right? I walked out of the house and there was a domestic dispute, right? Or domestic violence. These are incidents that my students are seeing, and I told them, stop tracking it, because it's going to drive you crazy. Like, every day there's a different story, there's a different hashtag still, in May of 2021. And so they are like, listen, we want a solution. Where's the solution? Well, it starts with who has power, who is in control of the law. And so, of course, there is a lot of feedback that's negative around critical race theory, because if I benefit off of poverty,
of course,
if I benefit off of Black and brown children not getting quality education, if I benefit off of the contracts for standardized tests that lets me send my wife on vacations for 3 weeks and send my children to the best schools, and my mom and dad are in the best nursing home facilities or senior facilities, and why would I want to see critical race theory happen? Why would I want to see Gen Z with an HBCU track that really prepares them for other learning experiences that for so long they weren't even getting? And so we have to be mindful of that too, that yes, this is a racism issue, right? But we also realize that every community is benefiting off of those who are poverty pimp. And unfortunately, a lot of those people look like you and I.
That's right.
That are in communities that we have either grew up in, grew up around, or have family members who are still living in. And so, these conversations are so important. There was a question around the HBCU prep school, and I'm like, oh my God, I think that it's gonna grow into a school itself. But tell the people a little bit again about HBCU prep school, um, what it is exactly, and how people can connect.
Sure. HBCU Prep School is the name of my publishing company. As an educator, I always dreamed of opening a school, and I realized that, um, God's plan for me wasn't to open up a brick and mortar school, but to open up a publishing company. And through the publishing company, I'm really able to impact even more students, more children, more families, more educators by publishing books. And so the first book is called The ABCs of HBCUs. It's a really fun book that takes children on this, all access VIP tour of historically Black colleges. And we are also working on a coloring book. Really excited about 3 other projects that we have that are activity books. So the book only went from A to Z and was 27 pages. The activity books are intended for elementary, and we have a middle school book, and we'll come out with a high school book that really delves into the ins and outs of HBCUs. And just, think of any other summer activity book for young folks. This one will be really geared towards historically Black colleges and that experience. And then on, I think Monday, I will be releasing a trailer for a new book that I am coming out with that I'm really excited about. And so the goal of the publishing company is really to be this book-based, education-based publishing company that creates books and content that prepares children to be successful at HBCU, so that they're not like me and just hearing about the African diaspora once they step foot onto an HBCU campus.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm hoping that Haley, she is a part of our Bright Beam network. She's one of our Gen Zers. She has her own show. She recently just did a virtual platform with my students in Atlanta, which was an amazing conversation. So check us out if you're on Facebook at Atlanta Blog, on Facebook and atlanta.org for our actual written articles. But she's amazing, and she graduated school early. She is now in her 2nd year of law school.
Wow.
And I want to say that Haley is 17. And so she is simply amazing. And it is happening everywhere. I think that I got that right. I think if I remember correctly, she's 16 and she's in her 3rd year. Actually, Josh, I think she just had her birthday. I think she is 17 because I remember her saying that. But yeah, I think she just had a birthday. But she's amazing, right? And so definitely would love her to get a part of the HBCU prep school and maybe get her first book out around her experience, right? And how this really helped her. And so I definitely want to end on this, that we need to make sure we're telling different stories. We know in public schools, our kids, they get the, dynamics of American history, right? That Black people started out as slaves, and look at all of this brutality and look at all of the violence. And then they're, given the portrayal of, Black people began to get lazy and strung out on drugs, hence the, crack meltdown, right, that they see in history books. And then they also see the police brutality against Black people because they are protesting and all of that jazz. And so we need to be able to share other stories around the successes of Black people, around the Black chemists, right? They helped to create hair care products, and those scientists that were doing their things early on that we don't hear about, we don't learn about. Black journalists, Black publishers, all of that jazz. And so we need to make sure we're celebrating these stories, we're sharing these stories, and that we have entities like HBCU Prep School that are publishing stories like this from this amazing author, but also maybe others who can connect. So Claudia, thank you so much for being on. Book is simply amazing. I know that you're going to have that list together of the schools in Atlanta, and I'm definitely challenging Atlanta Public Schools, especially as they are, of course, the capital school system in the state, and they influence so many others, to make sure that these classrooms have this book and they have other books that are similar, that are really preparing our children for better educational outcomes post-graduation and getting them prepared in enough time. So again, Claudia, thank you so much. Everyone, please check out HBCU Prep School. We will be off next week. Bright Beam Network will be getting some rest, spending time with family and love. But we will be seeing you all again on Monday, June the 7th, 12 o'clock noon. Tanisha, as well as our brother Neo, who is doing the work in Tulsa right now, getting ready for the centennial. We'll all be back, one happy family, to continue to bring you guys some special announcements and awesome guests. So until next time, peace and love, everyone.